things about the Russian special military operation. The first thing he said was Russia was unprepared for a medium-sized positional war. I have no idea what that meant. What does that mean?
Well, I think what he's talking about is the war that's being fought right now. It's not World War II. Nations mobilized against nations, total war. But it's not a tiny regional conflict either, like Syria. It's something in between where you have major armies fighting each other, but not in large wars of maneuver, but rather this positional warfare, this war of attrition where the Ukrainians are dug in, the Russians are dug in. The Russians don't want to launch expensive assaults to break through the lines, so they begin the process of blowing them up with artillery, closing in, but the Ukrainians are firing artillery back, and there's heavy casualties on both sides. That's what he's talking about. That's what I believe he's talking about.
Okay. The other thing he said, the outstanding number of frauds in the army. I think I know what that means, Scott, but what do you think that means?
Look, Russia inherited a military that was broken. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the Soviet Army went through a very difficult period in transitioning not just to the Russian Federation Army, but the different component parts. So there was negotiations taking place on what goes where, who does what. You went from a singular institution to one that was being broken up. And there was no money. So whatever is left for the Russians, it was underfunded. Then you had the war in Chechnya that didn't go well. You had morale issues. And then you had the lengthy process of trying to rebuild it in an environment where, when we say rebuild, we're talking about money. We're talking about significant amounts of money that are going into defense industries and other institutions to rebuild the military. But Russia at that time was a nation whose economy was corrupted by oligarchs, and there was a get rich quick type mentality that bled over into the military, and it infected the military at pretty much every level. And it's something that, as Russia has progressed out of the 90s, the Russian leadership, Vladimir Putin, has taken a very harsh position on corruption, on the influence of the oligarchs, and he's tried to weed it out of civilian life, the civilian economy. But the defense is, it's a more insular thing, and in the military, you're sort of separate from the civilians, so you're relying on the military to clean itself. And there is cleaning going on. It's not a total loss, but if you don't think that some of that residual corruption, carried over to the present, especially when the Russian military hasn't been fundamentally tested. It's been going through this growth period. They've had sharp conflicts. There was a period in Chechnya. They had the brief war with Georgia. They've been in Syria, and they've been doing some small operations here and there, but they haven't been tested in terms of a systemic fashion. And so certainly when this war began, and suddenly the military is being called upon to function, you have 3 decades of atrophied muscles, so to speak, combined with residual corruption, because corrupt officers in the 1990s who aren't weeded out become corrupt officers in 2022. There's no doubt about that. And so there was a modicum of that. But I think one of the great things about the special military operation is that it exposed this. Because of the contingencies of war, Russia has been successful in identifying the issues and rectifying the issues. And I think the Russian military today is in a far stronger position than it was. And the other thing I'd like to point out is that a lot of this criticism about the Russian military, performance-wise, corruption-wise, comes from a cadre of people who fought in 2014, 2015 in the Donbass. And they have rather extremist positions vis-a-vis what should be happening there. They feel ownership for this struggle because they were there at the beginning. There's a lot of resentment in them for being abandoned for 8 years in their opinion. And they also believe that they know it all. They're the ones with the solution. And so now Russia is engaged, and you have people who weren't involved for the last 8 years coming in and taking charge and maybe not performing to the way they wanted, maybe not executing the strategy they wanted. So they interpret the fact that other people come in with a different vision as representing incompetence and corruption, et cetera. So I would also take a lot of the allegations of corruption and incompetence with a heavy grain of salt, because there's people working in Moscow who have a different vision of the overall strategic picture than a bunch of guys who are down in the weeds in the Donbass who think they know everything.
Another point that Koganyan made was the number of countries like China, India, and the United Arab Emirates who are not sanctioning Russia. They're calling for peace, but he said they're kind of wriggling. What are your thoughts on especially China? China come out very forcefully recently in the white paper that they wrote. Their secretaries of Foreign Affairs and Defense have really been lambasting the United States very directly. What are your thoughts on China? And they've been accused of maybe shipping lethal weapons to Russia. And I say, well, what the heck is wrong with that? Your thoughts?
Look, first of all, the issue of one nation supplying other nations weapons is between those two nations. It's nobody else's business. And for the West to suddenly take a principled position on China providing weapons to Russia while they're pouring $113 billion of military aid and other financial assistance to Ukraine it just shows hypocrisy, and it's ludicrous. I don't know what Russia's doing. You and I had this conversation about the drones early on, and I took the position that I didn't see why Russia would need Iranian drones. It turned out that Russians had a deficiency in drone technology, doctrine, and that the Iranian drones were in fact necessary, and therefore they purchased them. That's their business. I personally don't see how Russia would allow China to have their hand on the throttle of this war. And what I mean by the throttle is the key driving factor. One of the key driving factors in this war is artillery ammunition, the availability of the ammunition. The side that has the most ammunition applied to the most tubes tends to do the most damage, tends to prevail on the battlefield. And right now that's advantage Russia. But the implication is if they need Chinese ammunition, there's a deficiency of Russian ammunition. I don't accept that. I believe Russia is actually has a defense industry that's mobilized and is producing sufficient ammunition to meet the needs. But that's an outside opinion. I don't know that for a fact. So let's hypothetically say that Russia doesn't have enough ammunition. By bringing China into the picture, what you've allowed now is China gets to dictate the pace of your operations. Now, that's great if China's your friend and says unlimited ammunition, all you need, et cetera. But if China gets in a position where suddenly Taiwan, the U.S. puts something on the table and it's looking attractive to China, but the U.S. says, slow it down a little bit. Suddenly the train might be late. The factory might shut down. And China's throttling down the ammunition at a time when Russia might need it. And now China's in control of a Russian operation that's essential for Russian national security. So I just think it's a silly thing. But again, I don't know what's going on in Russia. I don't know the calculations. I just happen to believe that it'd be better for the Russians to double their ammunition production rate by building new factories in Russia so that they're in control of the situation rather than delegating control of the throttle to a third party, even if it's China who is saying the right things in terms of relationships between the collective West and Russia and China, but hasn't jumped on board. I mean, they're wearing a shirt that says Team Russia, but they haven't, come on over and sat down on the bench. They're not going in the locker with Russia for their own reasons. And one of the main reasons is that China has traditionally embraced a Westphalian principle when it comes to respecting the sovereignty of other nations. And they believe that the Russian invasion of Ukraine violates that principle. And so they've been hesitant to endorse it. But also what's happening now is, and we see with the rhetoric of the Chinese, they're accepting the reality of this war's transition from a Russian versus Ukraine conflict to a Russian versus the collective West conflict. And so now they're looking at it and they're saying, no, now we're on Team Russia when it comes to Russia versus the collective West. And I see that transition being made right now. And but I'm hesitant to embrace without further evidence the idea that China is going to be providing Russia with lethal assistance, artillery, ammunition, things of that nature. It just doesn't make any sense. I don't see Russia needing it. I don't see Russia wanting it, and I don't see Russia, giving control of the throttle of war, the throttle of victory, to China.
Yeah. Do you think China realizes that they are next?
Oh, they know that. I mean, China's fully cognizant of that. That's why, look, there's a diplomatic dance taking place right now. China has a very principled position that it's held for many, many decades, and they're not going to abandon it because that position defines the stance they've taken on Taiwan. So if they accept, intervention into the sovereign, affairs of other states, then they legitimize America's interest in Taiwan. So China can't do that. So they have to maintain this principled stance. But they've been working very hard with Russia on allowing Russia to pivot economically, to develop new markets. They've placed diplomatic pressures on the developing world to create markets, not to sanction Russia. So I think the Chinese have been very, very good friends. It's not the kind of friendship that maybe some people want, where you have to, fly the Russian flag and sing Russian songs and parade. It's quiet friendship. It's friendship that matters, friendship that matters most right now. Russia doesn't need China to sit there and be your cheerleader for this conflict. Russia doesn't need that. First of all, what would it change? Nothing. What Russia needs is China to be doing exactly what it's doing, being there economically, being there diplomatically, and just being there. So I don't criticize China. I don't criticize India. I don't criticize any nation that has, not embraced or not succumbed to the pressure of sanctions. This war has put everybody in a very, very difficult position. Ask the Russian people themselves. How many Russian people are truly, when this thing started, yeah, baby, let's go into Ukraine? I think that there was a lot of Russian people going, I'm not comfortable with this. I got a gut problem with this. Well, you know what? If the average Russian has a gut problem, what do you think the rest of the world's doing? War is a horrible thing. Nobody wants a war. And the nuances of the Russian justification of this war, which I actually support, I think the Russians have articulated a cognizable case under Article 51 of the United Nations Charter for preemptive collective self-defense. But me just saying that alone confuses people, let alone digging into the details of it. So please forgive people and nations when they go, I don't know, man, this is tough. This is a tough one, especially a war that has not ended the way Russia thought it would. Now we know what Russia wanted on phase one. And this is another reason why I take a departure with the gentleman's conclusion, because he's concluding that this war inevitably was going to be a medium-sized war of attrition. That's not what Russia wanted. The reason why Russia went in with a special military operation the way they did, we now know, is because they were trying to get the Ukrainians to the negotiating table. 3 meetings in Gomel, Belarus, that led to a potential 4th meeting in Istanbul, where a finalized treaty was ready for signature that would have ended this conflict. That was the sole purpose of the. People were like, why did they steamroll him? Why did they do that? I was the same way. You know that. We had this conversation. I'm like, bring it on doctrinally, baby. Roll over them, kill them all, sort the bodies out later. And the Russians are going, that ain't our strategy, you see, because we don't want war. Wow, imagine that. The Russians don't want war. The Russians wanted peace, but they were blocked every step of the way by, Poroshenko, by Merkel, by Hollande, who said Minsk is a sham. Well, gosh, if Putin invested everything into making Minsk a reality, when the people he's supposed to be negotiating with are lying to him the whole time, you can't blame Russia for that. And then when Russia said, okay, since Minsk is a sham, what if we put forward new treaty vehicles, which they did in December 17th of 2021, the NATO treaty, the United States treaty, they said, we can still prevent a war if you accept this new European security framework we're talking about. You don't even have to accept the whole thing. All we want you to do is read it and then seriously sit down and talk with us about this. And then we don't have to have a war. But if you ignore us, then there will be a military technical solution. The military technical solution was a special military operation specifically designed to get Zelensky's government to the negotiating table. Ask yourself the following question. If Russia was at war with Ukraine, why is Zelensky alive? Why is Zelensky able to make phone calls? Why is Zelensky able to do video conferencing? Why is Zelensky able to work from a bunker in the Ministry of Defense? If this was a war, none of that infrastructure would exist. They would all be dead or scattered. It's not a war. Russia deliberately allowed the Ukrainian government to exist, to function, to engage in the diplomacy necessary for other nations to talk to Ukraine about taking negotiations seriously. And so Russia enabled a peaceful outcome. If the Russian plan had succeeded and it was on the verge of succeeding, this war would have been over on April 1st. This war would have been over on April 1st. Hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians would be alive today. $1 trillion of Ukrainian infrastructure would still be functioning. Tens of millions of Ukrainian civilians would be in their home, jobs, their kids going to school. And it's not Russia's fault that it happened. But phase one was that. So, hey, excuse me, Mr. Professor, you, the gentleman who wrote the paper, it wasn't Russia's goal to go into a medium-sized war of attrition. That's what they inherited after the West rejected the peace opportunity that Russia made possible by phase one of their special military operation.
So, Scott, my last question.
Before I have a heart attack?
Where is Russia at today? Everybody seems, was waiting for this big offensive on the anniversary. It hasn't happened. In your opinion, is this another phase in the war? What is? People want to hear this from you. What do you think Russia's strategy is now?
Well, I mean, you know, you've spoken to Ray McGovern. You know Ray McGovern, old Soviet analyst from the CIA, and Ray has opened my eyes on a number of things because he's a guy that's been there, done that, and he taught me a while back that the best way to figure out what somebody's doing is to listen to them. You know, Vladimir Putin gave a speech on February 21st. It's sort of the State of the Nation address to the Federal Assembly. And if you listen to what it's, because a lot of people, I don't understand the impatience of people. They wanted him to come out and basically put up a map and draw a big arrow on it saying, I'm ordering the Russian army to march on Kiev and it's all going to be over today. And when he didn't do that, they went, man, that's under, what the hell's going on? I'm disappointed in Putin. Listen to what he's saying, guys, because he told you exactly what's going to happen. He said, first of all, if you listen to the language, he likened the present conflict to the Great Patriotic War. He kept alluding to that. He talked about the cost that's been paid by the nation, and that the veterans and their families must be taken care of in a similar fashion to those who had gone before them. So he knows the nation's at war. He's also talked about the fact that defense industry is on a war footing, producing the sufficient resources necessary for this conflict. He knows there's a war. Well, then why isn't he drawing a big arrow to Kiev? Listen to what he said, guys. It's never been the mission of the special military operation to draw a big arrow to Kiev. He's focused on improving the economic and social lives of the population of Novorossiya and Donbass. Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Lugansk. That's what he's doing. And he's going to secure them by pushing the Ukrainian forces back to the range of the weapon systems provided by NATO, which in this case means the HIMARS with the small bomb rocket, which means 150 kilometers. For all you people that are looking for big arrows, he just drew a lot of big arrows, guys. I mean, it's a simple exercise. Get one of those compasses, you know, that you used to use as a kid, protractor set and all that kind of stuff. Put the needle on the border of Novorossiya, the far western border, go to a scale, figure out what 150 kilometers is, and then just start drawing range circles, and you'll see what that means. Oh, gosh, does that mean Odessa is within? Yes, it is. Is Kharkov in there? Oh, yes, it is. Dnipropetrovsk? Yeah. Guys, Vladimir Putin just told you what's going to happen. Okay, it's the biggest arrow game of them all. He's just not crude and has to draw it for you. You just have to listen to what he's saying. Russia's at war. Defense industry's cooking. The people that he's responsible for protecting will be protected. And those who are threatening them will be pushed back to the distance, the maximum distance of the weapons provided, which is 150 kilometers right now for the HIMARS. Congratulations, Ukraine, by the way, for accepting that weapon. It didn't change the outcome on the battlefield. All it did is guarantee that your nation will be further fractured. Now, what he didn't say is what's going to happen when you take Odessa, Kharkov, Dnipropetrovsk. But we know what's going to happen because he's already told us. Listen to the president. His responsibility is to the Russian nation. And the Russian nation is not defined by the borders of the Russian Federation. It's defined by Russian people, people who have shared culture, language, history, religion. His job is to protect them. Never again will they be abandoned. That's the essence of his 2005 speech, where he said one of the greatest tragedies in the last century was the end of the Soviet Union. Everybody picked up on that and said, oh, he wants to bring the Soviet Union back. You don't know Vladimir Putin very well if you think he wants to bring the Soviet Union back. Because the next sentence said it all, because overnight, tens of millions of Russians became homeless. And as the Russian president, he can't accept that. There has to be a home for the Russian people. They have to be secured. They have to be safe. And right now, if you're a Russian living in Odessa, Dnipropetrovsk, Kharkov, you're not safe. You're not secure. So the Russian president's going to take care of them. Listen to the president. He made it quite clear what's going to happen. Now, people say, well, where's the military in all this? I don't know, guys. Again, why don't you just take a look at what's happened? Phase one, I already told you about phase one. It's not a debate anymore. We know what it was. 200,000 men trying to put short-term pressure on the Kiev government to get them to the negotiating table to bring an end to this conflict on terms acceptable to Russia. No membership in NATO, independence of Donetsk and Lugansk, Crimea, Russia forever. But there was nothing in that 1 April peace treaty that talked about Kherson and Zaporizhia. That territory would have been given back to Ukraine, just like the Russians voluntarily evacuated from Kiev, Sumy, and in other areas. They had no intention of stealing this Ukrainian territory. But then we go into phase two, which was that medium-sized war of attrition that was going, which Russia won, by the way. For all the corruption and all the stuff that everybody's talking about, Russia won that war. God, how did they win? Look at the damn casualties. One of the key aspects of war is to destroy your enemy. And Russia ground the Ukrainians down. How do you think you get the 350,000 dead, which is probably the number that we're looking at in terms of Ukrainian casualties? How do you get there? By killing them. And who was killing them? The Russian soldiers. Where? Right there on the Eastern Front. Right there on the Eastern Front. From May until August, there was this awful war of attrition that the Russians were winning. They were grinding the Ukrainian military down. And the only reason why the Ukrainian military was able to recover is because they received tens of billions of dollars worth of training, intelligence support, operational support, equipment that allowed them to reconstitute a military, which then exploited the fact that because Russia hadn't gone to a war footing, they could attack the extended flanks in Kharkov and in Kherson. And they did. And the Russians had to consolidate on a new defensive line. In the process, that Ukrainian force that was built up was wiped out. And now what the Russians did is they mobilized in September. Mobilized. Now, I don't know what people think mobilize means. It's not an instantaneous event. You actually have to get the guys organized. You have to identify them, put them through a processing thing, give them uniforms and stuff, and send them off for training. Now, about 80,000 of those guys received sort of refresher training because they had relevant military skills because they weren't out for a long time, and they were sent to the front to help strengthen the front line so that never again the Ukrainians would find overextended defenses. This would be doctrinal defenses in terms of proper concentration of forces on the front line with second and third lines of defense. Read Russian doctrine, people. Read it. I have. That's what it calls for. Strong points, cauldrons, fire cauldrons, sufficient artillery, so that you break up the attacks. They get in there, they get caught up in the second line of defense, they get blown to hell, they all die. That's what's been going on, all you big arrow proponents. What do you think the Ukrainians have been doing from, say, October until January? They've been launching attacks that have been failing. They've been hitting Russian defenses, and they're getting crushed. Where's the Russian offense? Right there, guys. The Russians are fighting a war. Look at the Russian casualty lists, and you'll understand they're fighting a war because Russia's losing a lot of guys. This isn't a Sitzkrieg of 1939. This is an active war of a scope and scale unimaginable to anybody. I didn't make that term up. That's Lieutenant General Cavoli, the commander of U.S. forces and NATO forces, speaking in Sweden in January. He said NATO couldn't imagine what the size of this conflict, the lethality of this conflict, which means NATO is not trained for it, prepared for it, can't fight it. That's what he was saying. And one of the main aspects of that is artillery. The role of artillery in this thing, the amount of ammunition being fired is just mind-boggling. NATO doesn't have that ammunition. And guess what? Ukraine's going to run out of ammunition this summer. Oh, Scott, how do you know that? Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, has said so. He said there's nothing NATO can do to reverse that. It's a big problem that Ukraine's going to have to deal with. Well, how do you deal with an artillery-driven war when you run out of artillery ammunition? You die, you lose. And that's what people were saying. Where's the offense? I just told you guys, war is about attriting the enemy's capabilities down. You don't have to do that big arrow. You do that by maintaining constant military pressure on them, and you kill their soldiers at a rate greater than they kill your soldiers, and you get them to expend their resources, either by having them use them or lose them. And right now, why do you think Ukraine is out there begging for more tanks, more artillery, more ammunition? Because they don't have it. Why don't they have it? Because the Russians have been destroying it. That means Russia has never stopped on the attack. Everybody wants this great drive. Well, it takes time to develop, and it takes resources. If you look at the Ministry of Defense, they've been telling you all along that there are specific units that are organized to carry out so-called breakthrough or breakout operations. And they're training right now, doing combined arms, maneuver warfare in an environment that's designed to replicate the reality of the Ukrainian battlefield. They're training for war, people. You sort of want your units that are going to be engaged in this kind of operation to be well trained, and it takes time. Thank God the Russian military didn't bow to the pressure of the concerned population and take untrained units, put them on the front line, and get them slaughtered. Instead, what the Russians are doing is the hard, bloody business of war. They are maintaining a constant pressure on the battlefield, not just in Bakhmut, which is getting a lot of attention, but in Zaporizhia and Uladar up near Limon. There's all these offensives taking place. And what's happening is Ukrainians have to disperse their reserves, peter them out. The Russians are shaping the battlefield to their advantage so that when these units finish training and they come to the battlefield, there will be opportunities for them to exploit. That's what's going on. It's called war, and Russia's winning this war. I don't know what people want. Do you really want the Russians to draw a giant big arrow towards Kiev, take these units, throw them in there? You know, they did that in the Second World War. We can talk about Operation Bagration all we want. We can talk about the destruction of Army Group Center, and everybody focuses on the German casualties. Look at the Soviet casualties. Hundreds of thousands of dead men, hundreds of thousands of dead, millions of wounded, thousands of tanks lost in a victory, because that kind of big arrow war is expensive. Russia doesn't want to do that. They don't need to do that. They're winning right now. Just let the military do what it's doing. Have patience. The Russians have never looked to a calendar. I remember back in the spring, Russia's got to take Mariupol by Victory Day. Who the hell came up with that? Did Putin say that? Did the general staff say that? Did anybody? It was social media. It was people who aren't friends of Russia saying this because they're trying to put an artificial constraint on a military campaign that's not defined by the calendar, but by battlefield results. And right now, the Russians are getting the battlefield results they need to get to win. They're grinding the Ukrainians down to nothing. The Ukrainians are. Why is Ukrainian mobilization consist of guys going around and kidnapping people? Because they're desperate. Why are they running around begging for more tanks and artillery? They're desperate. Why are they desperate? Because the Russian military is doing its job in creating desperation by grinding the Ukrainians down on the battlefield. That's what's happening.